Greetings all, this is Rick Levine with your June 2024 astrological forecast. Once again, I want to offer my sincere thanks to all of you who participate on my monthly YouTube channel. Once again, we've had over 70,000 views this past month. And obviously, none of this would be possible without your support and without those of you who support this work on Patreon. And if you're not familiar with Patreon and my subscription offerings there, please feel free to check out my page on patreon.com/Rick Levine. And by the way, all links that I mention will be in the first comments below that will be pinned to the to this video itself. And while I'm on this thought, I just also would like to take a moment to remind you all to subscribe to this channel and to give it a thumbs up. It just helps. It helps me. It helps us. It helps YouTube know that we are actually here. And speaking of staying in touch, I also invite you to jump over to my webpage, www.ricklevineastrologer.com, and subscribe to my email list. And even if you're following me here already on YouTube or on Instagram or on Facebook, it helps. It just takes a minute. It's your way of making sure that you're informed by whatever the most significant astrological happenings are, and plus getting notified of my YouTube videos when they're available and other astrological happenings. And of course, I promise that you will not be overwhelmed with frequent mailings and just additional marketing stuff one after another. And also, I also, as I announced over the last couple of months, I'm doing an introductory natal chart interpretation each month for someone on my mailing list, and these are focused specifically on harmonic aspects. Last month, our first winner of a free harmonic aspect natal chart reading was Gianna McDermott. And the June winner is Jackie Robert. And Jackie, you will receive an email in the next few days with instructions on how to follow up and get your individual consultation on harmonic aspects. And by the way, the winners are always selected by my assistant, Gail, using software that generates a random number that is then matched up with the numbers of those people who are generated from my email list. All right, a couple of housekeeping things, and for those of you who want to breeze through this, the links down below will be available for you to go directly to the pages and pass through all this if you want. By the way, it often takes a day or two for those links to all be put up, and so be patient there. I am recording this on the afternoon of May 31st, and this will be posted by Saturday, June 1st. But what that means is, because I'm going to be out of town next week, Astrology Night is being held a week earlier than normal. Instead of the first Friday night of the month, which would be June 7th, Astrology Night is on Friday evening, May 31st. So by the time you're watching this, if you've missed the Astrology Night live, the link will also be down below for the recording of the May 31st Friday night Astrology Night. And starting next month, they will be back to the first Friday night of the month, July 5th, and then August 2nd, September 6th, and so on. Just a couple of quick recaps. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but the reason why Astrology Night is a week earlier is that the first Friday night of the month, on June 7th, I will be with Lynn Bell, Maurice Fernandez, Amir Bey, and Linda Tucker doing a workshop in Rhinebeck, New York at the Omega Institute. There's still room there for late registrants. And again, the link is below, and this is going to be about the entrance into the age of Aquarius and the Aquarius-Leo axis, because, of course, in astrology, all signs imply their opposite, and especially when we go south of the equator. And we will have Linda Tucker, the keeper of the white lions in South Africa, as part of the emerging Leo, the importance of the Leo axis coming up in the future. The following weekend, on June 15th, I will be at the Boston NCGR, that's the National Council for Geocosmic Research, and I will be doing a relationships workshop from 1 to 5 p.m. at the Belmont Community Center, and the title of the workshop is Beyond Venus and Mars. And for detailed information on that, more information, the link will be below, and that's NCGR Boston, and that'll be on Saturday afternoon, June 15th. Then, at the end of August, I will be in England at the 56th AA, that's the Astrological Association, the Astrological Association of Great Britain. And the conference there will be diverse perspectives, all themes considered. And this is going to be at a gorgeous conference venue up at the Leonardo Hotel on Hinckley Island. It's near Coventry, between Leicester and Birmingham. And that's going to be August 28th through September 1st. I'll be doing a pre-conference workshop on harmonic aspects and natal chart consultations, and I will be doing a talk during the conference also. So that is the AA conference in England. Then coming up in in September, I'll be doing an Inner Circle guide. I will be an Inner Circle guide for the Astrology Hub Inner Circle. That'll be during the month of September. You'll need to be an Astrology Hub Inner Circle member to get all of that stuff. Then in October is the OPA Astrology Retreat. And the title of this conference is Awakening, Celebrating the Aquarian Shift, Connect and Learn. This is going to be at a gorgeous retreat center up in Park City, Utah. And I'll be doing a presentation on the opening day on what is the Aquarian shift and why is it so important now. And then I'll be leading a 3-day immersion track on improving natal chart consultations, and there's a complete write-up on this on the OPA website for the conference, and again, the link is down below in the comments. But the other astrologers there, this is going to, it's an interesting conference because after the first day, you spend 3 full days with one track leader in a group that is limited to 9 people. And so you get your choice of working with Lynn Bell or Ann Orderly or Sam Reynolds, Christopher Renstrom, Moon Zlotnick, Kira Sutherland, Donna Young, Kay Taylor, Arlen Weiss, Alexandra Caracosta, Gina Picasso, Louise Eddington, and of course myself. And I'll see many of you there. Then in late November, November 23rd to December 4th, I am back in Goa, India for a 12-day full immersion astrological experience. And this is in at a magical Ayurvedic retreat center in the south end of Goa. This is a complete conference package. You can find out all the information, including a day-by-day itinerary and the full curriculum, at heavenandearthworkshops.com, and the link to the exact conference schedule is also down below. And this will be my 13th Heaven and Earth Workshops retreat, and will combine pretty much the best of all my previous teachings. So this will probably be a sold-out event. It is limited to about 35 people, and I encourage you to think about this early, because it will most likely fill up. They usually do. Also, just very quickly, I'd like to mention that I'll be back at the Conscious Life Expo in February of 2025. Then I will be participating in Convergence 2025, March 7th through 9th in Orlando, Florida. And this is a conference being put on by Cosmic Patterns. It looks like it's going to be a very exciting conference, combining the best of vibrational astrology and some other community-oriented and wider teachings outside of just the vibrational perspective itself. And I'm looking forward to that one. And then in May, just prior to the next NORWAC, and by the way, I'm still recovering from NORWAC last weekend. It was an amazing conference. I'll have more to say on that in the days and weeks ahead. But prior to the 2025 NORWAC, I will be speaking at the Portuguese Astrology Association in Porto, Portugal, and this will be May 9th through 12th, and I'll have more information on that coming up, but I'm excited to be back for the Portuguese Astrology Association. It will be my third time speaking at one of their international congresses. And so that's pretty much it, the stuff that's coming up. And, there's no doubt at all, as we get into looking at June, there's no doubt at all that we have now entered new territory. For those of you who watch my monthly, either live streamed or watching it after the fact, I will spend time later tonight, because I'm recording this on the afternoon of Friday. I'll be doing the Astrology Night event later this evening, but I'll be doing quite a deeper dive into the Jupiter's move into Gemini and Jupiter trining Pluto and what that means and how that all relates to what's going on politically, not only in the United States with the conviction of Donald Trump on 34 felony accounts, but also what's going on in the Mideast and Gaza, and this being the 31st of May. I also just want to mention that just over 100 years ago, actually 103 years ago today, this is the 103rd anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre, and I would just like to acknowledge that and acknowledge the fact that so much of our history is written from specific points of view, and we are seeing that unfold even these days right now. But this was, a massacre in Tulsa of a concentrated black community, black-owned businesses, and property that was quite prosperous. And the massacre victims were buried in unmarked graves, and people who even grew up and lived in Tulsa never even heard of it. It really wasn't until the 1990s, I believe, that events began to force the shocking history back into the public eye. it's estimated that the Ku Klux Klan, numbering over 100,000 members at that time, was quite active, and during the massacre, there were at least 4,000 black residents that were arrested, and 35 square blocks of business district, 1,200 homes destroyed, about 300 people, nearly all African American, were killed in the massacre. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is not only to acknowledge that part of our history, of the history that we need not be proud of, but we need to be aware of, because we want to make sure that those kinds of events not only don't happen again, even though to some extent it's unfolding right now before our eyes. But it's important as astrologers that we look at patterns, and again, I'll have more to say about this in tonight's discussion at Soul Food Coffee House. So enough said there. Moving into June, I just want to reiterate that so much of the last couple of years has really been a setup for this blast into the future that's occurring over the next few years. And it's important to understand that Jupiter's entrance or ingress, which is the astrological word, Jupiter's ingress into Gemini is absolutely part and parcel of the larger scene that's going on. Now, Jupiter only entered into Gemini just about a week ago. Actually, it was on May 25th. And as we look at the chart for June 1st, we can see that that Jupiter is at 1 degree, actually about 1.5 degrees of Gemini, and we can see that Pluto, which is retrograding back toward Capricorn, slowly but steadily, and it will be back in Capricorn in September, October, November, and then direct back into Aquarius by December, where it will then stay for the next couple of decades. Now, the reason why this is so significant is that although Jupiter changes signs every year, it's about a 12-year run through the zodiac. So about every year, give or take a couple of months because of the retrograde process, that once a year Jupiter changes signs, and Jupiter just did that last week. But in astrology, we consider the rarer an event is, in some ways, the more important it is. And of course, Jupiter enters a new sign once a year. And in fact, Jupiter enters the sign of Gemini once every 12 years. But Jupiter hasn't entered Gemini to trine Pluto in Aquarius since the time of the American Revolution, since the late 18th century, the late 1700s. And again, this is something that is so significant because it's touching and rocking our history and also our view of current events. So the big switch of June is that Jupiter, having moved into Gemini, the Sun already in Gemini, and Venus in Gemini, and Mercury then moving into Gemini. Mercury moves into Gemini on June 3rd. That by that period of time, and then once we have the new moon in Gemini, the new moon in Gemini on June 6th, we will have the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Jupiter and Venus all in Gemini, and this is a big switch from the push forward when we had back a couple months ago of the energy in Aries, and we still, even at the beginning of June, we have the moon in Aries. We have the nodal axis, the north node, still going to be in Aries for the months ahead. And Chiron still in Aries. And Mars in Aries, but Mars enters Taurus on June 8th. And so we have this move away from the Aries energy, but we also have the movement of all those planets that had been in Taurus, holding things down, making things real, kind of giving us some grounded energy. Now, as all these planets move into Gemini, the Sun, Venus, Jupiter, Mercury, and then the moon at the new moon, we're going to be ready to fly. You know, Gemini is a fickle energy because it's like the spring breezes that change. They blow one way or another. Think of a kite bouncing around, you know, in the breeze. In some ways, that's what the energy is going to be like for much of June, and yet that gives us a sense of freedom, of being able to adapt to a new landscape. And this is largely what's going on. And in some ways, this adaptation to this new landscape is really a dry run for what happens in 2025 when Uranus moves, after being in Taurus for 7 years. Uranus moves into Gemini, and Uranus will move into Gemini next summer in July. And then it will back up into Taurus just for a few months, November through April of 2026. And then it'll be in Gemini again for the next 6 years. So this energy of this movement today, today meaning June 1st and through the early part of June, this movement into Gemini is really kind of it's a harbinger of things to come. It's like a wetting of the whistle of what's going to occur on a much deeper and more profound level as Uranus moves into Gemini, and as each planet moves into Gemini or has moved into Gemini recently, starting last month with the Sun and Venus, and now with Jupiter, and then later in the month with Mercury, and as each planet moves into Gemini, it will make a trine to Pluto, still getting its feet wet. Okay, that sounds weird, getting its feet wet in Aquarius, but Aquarius, even though it's the water bearer, is actually an air sign. So it's really like getting its mind exploded into the future. And so we're getting each of these planets making trines with Pluto, as Uranus will through 26, 27, 28. And this is going to be a huge shift for humanity all over the planet. I'll have a lot to say about that later tonight when I do the live from Soul Food. You can watch it again after the fact, and this certainly will become a topic in the months and even years ahead. So here we are on June 1st, and we can see that we have those three planets, the Sun, Venus, and Jupiter in Gemini. And in fact, we have Venus now moving slightly faster than the Sun, and Venus will catch up to the Sun, making an inferior or interior conjunction on June 4th. Considered to be a Kazimi Arabic for in the heart, because Venus will be in the heart of the Sun, and it is Hellenistic tradition that when planets get close to the Sun, they become invisible. They get lost in the beams of the Sun. But when they're exactly lined up with the Sun, this is like superpower. And so we have the Venus making a Kazimi with the Sun, in fact, on June 4th. And And then we have Mercury following the same on June 14th. And so there's a lot of Gemini energy. And of course, the new moon, which is kind of like a Cazimi itself on the 6th, although it's technically just a new moon, that we're really getting this Gemini energy. And again, Gemini is about mutuality. It's about split personality. Well, actually, it's less about personality being split than it is about reality being bifurcated, which of course we're all experiencing these days with the extreme split between every issue that we can possibly think of. And yet Gemini gives us this ability to think about both sides of the equation simultaneously. In a way, Gemini is less about split personality than it is about mutual realities, mutual desires, things appearing as pairs. Even our brain is bicameral, meaning two-chambered. And so we perceive things both spatially and temporally. We perceive things both emotionally and logically. And so we have this kind of, in Gemini, we have this adaptability that occurs. And especially as Jupiter moves toward its trine to Pluto, I think we're really deeply seeding this energy in a way that's very, very powerful. So on June 1st, we can see that the moon is in Aries, and the moon actually stays in Aries through Sunday, and on the 2nd, late at night, 10:55 p.m. And of course, all times that I give here will be given in Pacific time. This is now Pacific Daylight Time, so you need to adjust to your time zone accordingly. All horoscope wheels that we look at will have an Aries rising. And of course, looking at this, we can see also that Neptune is at 29 degrees of Pisces, 29 and 2/3 of a degree, 29 degrees 41 minutes. And it's almost as if that Neptune is heading towards 0 degrees Aries, but as we know, Neptune will turn retrograde early next month, and it won't reach Aries until next year, which is quite significant because Saturn is also turning retrograde this month in June. These are important pieces of what's happening in June. And as Saturn turns retrograde on June 29th, it'll do that at just about 19 and a half degrees of Pisces. But right now, Saturn is almost at 19 degrees of Pisces already. So Saturn won't even move 1 degree. It'll move 3/4 of a degree in the entire month as it slows down to turn retrograde. And that Saturn won't really catch up to Neptune until it does it. Saturn will catch up to Neptune in February of 2026. So that's still about a year and a half, almost 2 years down the road. But this is also part of the big things that are coming up. And yet with Jupiter now moving into Gemini, and as Jupiter moved into Gemini and makes an exact trine with Pluto, and that exact trine that Jupiter makes with Pluto is on June 2nd. So let's actually move this chart ahead to June 2nd. And again, all charts here are for noon, so that on June 2nd, we can see that the moon is still, on Sunday midday, still in Aries, actually lined up with Chiron, heading toward a conjunction with Mars later in the day on Sunday. And it won't be until late Sunday night at 10:55 p.m. when the moon enters Taurus. But what we have on the 2nd is Jupiter making its exact trine to Pluto, which really deepens and gives power to this new reality that we're trying to adapt to. And the other thing that's quite significant here is that as Jupiter has moved through the last degree of Taurus and then entered Gemini back about a week ago on May 24th, 5th, 6th, that it also made a sextile with Neptune. And we have what we call a minor grand trine, which is two planets that are trine, that is Jupiter and Pluto, with Neptune right at the midpoint sextile, each of them within a degree or so. And so this is close enough to be an important aspect that still allows for the confusion to continue. But remember, over the next year and a half, we have Saturn moving closer and closer to its conjunction to Neptune. And right now, this is about as close as the Saturn-Neptune conjunction will get. They are both cohabitating the sign of Pisces. But as Saturn turns retrograde toward the end of the month on the 29th, that distance will begin to increase. And I think that the truth of what the reality is might actually take a while longer to get to. So, on the 2nd, we do have the Jupiter trine Pluto. That's exact late afternoon. But this is an aspect that's been holding for days and will continue to impact us for days. And for that matter, because Mercury comes into Gemini on the 3rd and trines Pluto on the 3rd, that Mercury comes in right behind it, and then Mercury will catch up to Jupiter on the 4th, that we're really in the midst of the deepening of our communication, even though there's lots of words being thrown around, lots of overinflated, lots of Mercury-Jupiter kind of going over the top, saying more than needs to be said, stretching the truth even, but that with Pluto there, it really deepens it, and this has something to do with the recreation of a wider sense of community that may end up being the thing that holds humanity together rather than having it simply explode apart at the seams. So on the 2nd, we also have Mercury as it's moving toward the last degree of Taurus. Mercury makes that exact sextile with Neptune, and of course then it moves into Gemini, and then it will then make the trine to Pluto by the 3rd. So we can watch that Mercury as it moves over the next couple of days. And if we move this ahead to June 3rd, we now can see that the moon midday is in Taurus at about 7 degrees at noon. And we can also see now that Mercury has entered Gemini, and now Mercury is moving toward the trine to Pluto. That's not exact until later in the day, actually 11:12 p.m., just after 11 p.m. here on the west coast of the United States. But again, this is a hugely powerful period of time for speaking the truth without any bullshit attached to it, even though Gemini on some level is the planet of bullshit. And I don't necessarily mean that as everything that Geminis are saying is not true, but Gemini has this ability to talk out of both sides of the mouth. Gemini has the ability, I think of Bob Dylan as being a classic Gemini, who can actually, you never know when he's telling the truth or not, because there's always the element of story. Dylan back in the day could give 2 press conferences where he'd tell absolutely different stories in answer to the same question. They both couldn't be true, but he expressed them as if they were. And in some ways, one could say that's a poet's license, and it is maybe where fact meets fiction, or where fiction maybe ignores fact. But sometimes there's more truth in fiction than there is in nonfiction. But that's another story. Nevertheless, on the 3rd, we definitely get that Mercury conjunct Jupiter trining Pluto, and even the midpoint of Mercury and Jupiter, Mercury being at just under 1 degree of Gemini at noon, and Jupiter being just over 2 degrees, them actually both making those trines, the midpoint even more closely to Pluto, I think is quite important. As we move ahead to the 4th, notice though here, even on the 3rd, how close Venus is to the Sun. It's less than 1/4 of a degree away from the Sun. And as we move to June 4th, we can see that Venus jumps to the other side of the Sun, while Mercury is separating on the other side of Jupiter, moving away from Jupiter now. But these are still all pretty close conjunctions that are still going to be close. And in fact, we also see on the 4th that the moon at 22 degrees of Taurus midday is just a few hours away from conjoining Uranus. These are all pretty powerful energies, and I think that the amount of Gemini energy that's cooking up a storm, even with the moon lining up with Uranus and Taurus, you'd think that would be grounding because it's in Taurus. The moon is happy to be in Taurus. It's exalted there. But the fact of the matter is that Taurus, that Uranus, even in Taurus, is going to be looking for planets in Aquarius, because Uranus is at home, at least the modern ruler, the planet that's associated in modern astrology with Aquarius. And so this emphasizes that Pluto in Aquarius, even again with these planets, especially Jupiter and Mercury trining Pluto still, this is all very, very important stuff. And this is for Tuesday, June 4th, when Mercury makes its exact conjunction with Jupiter. Again, exaggeration or saying too much. And Venus makes its exact cazimi with the Sun. And those are both in the morning on Tuesday, the 4th. And then as we move to the 5th, the moon moves into Gemini, and the moon moves into Gemini at about 1:30 a.m., so by midday it's already about 6 degrees into Gemini. And here we're approaching the new moon, and the new moon in Gemini actually occurs at 5:37 a.m., at 16 degrees of Gemini and 18 minutes. And this would be on the 6th. We've moved ahead to the 6th. And on the 6th, what's significant here is that this new moon in Gemini is closely conjoined with Venus, even though the Venus-Sun conjunction has already occurred. The moon comes sweeping through there just an hour or so after the new moon, and it's very, very, it's a sweet new moon because of the new moon conjoining with Venus. On the other hand, we also have the Sun and Venus making sesquisquares. That's a square and a half to Pluto. And here we have an important piece coming in that makes this new moon a bit darker than it's going to seem to many astrologers who for some reason ignore the half square and square and a half, which we know not only are real aspects, but are every bit as strong as a square or an opposition, especially when they're exact, and especially when they're picking up on planets that are already square. And what we have here is that this new moon is also square to Saturn, and the moon square Saturn occurs just a couple of hours, maybe 4 or 5 hours after the new moon, and then the Sun's square to Saturn occurs on June 9th. We'll get there in just a moment. But we're meeting resistance. We're meeting the old guard. We're meeting those people trying to hold on to a status quo that isn't working, and they're going to do that with strength and with authority. And this new moon is also a square and a half to Pluto. Pluto. And why this is so important, and I know I talked about this last month, is that last month, at the beginning of the month, we had Saturn making its first of 3 exact half squares to Pluto. And that Saturn half square Pluto that was exact on May 6th will be exact again on September 25th and then again January 26th of 2025. And the Saturn-Pluto square, half square, opposition, square and a half square conjunction, that cycle is really the cycle that is at play when national boundaries rub up against each other. In fact, we know that when planets are making squares or half squares or oppositions or conjunctions to Saturn and to Pluto, especially when they're in a half square themselves, this is the exacerbation of wars and certainly what's been going on in the Mideast, going back to last October when Mars was squaring Pluto, and then Mars conjoined Pluto, and then the Saturn half square to Pluto the beginning of May and the beginning of the attack on Rafah, and all of this is tied into this new moon because the new moon is actually forming a square with Saturn and a square and a half with Pluto. And the Saturn-Pluto half square itself is still 2 degrees of orb, and that for a half square, I would use 3-degree orb as something that would absolutely still be effective. So this is a very, very potent new moon, and it's still important to understand that the Jupiter trine Pluto is still in orb. It's still within a degree of orb at the time of the new moon. And Venus is still at that square and a half point to Pluto, just like the sun is. And Venus and the sun at the new moon are about 1/4 of a degree from being that square and a half to Pluto. So this is an incredibly, incredibly potent period of time, and one that I think that from the new moon on the 6th all the way through the 9th, when the sun finally moves through the square to Saturn, even later on the 6th, when Mercury is making a half square to Chiron, and all of this, the words can cause more damage here than we intend, and I think that we can see some real power plays going on here. These are not easy days. Even with all these planets in Gemini, it's like the storms are blowing every which way. You know, the winds of change are blowing, but they're not just blowing in a steady way that we can catch it in our sails and head off into the future. The winds are shifting every few minutes, every few hours, every few days right now, and this energy kind of sticks with us. By the way, as we continue to move forward, on Friday the 7th, we have the moon moves into Leo midday. I'm sorry, on Friday the 7th, the moon moves into Cancer, and that's early in the morning. It's at about 5:40 a.m. On the 7th, and by the time we get to the 8th, we have now Mars, which had been moving toward the latter degrees of Aries. Mars actually on the 8th enters it enters Taurus. It doesn't do it till 9:34 p.m., but we are going to be feeling this because Mars, even though it's not yet square by sign to Pluto, Mars is moving into a position where it's square to Pluto, and this once again is power struggle coming out in the open. It's the anger and the assertion and the aggression of Mars. Mars hot in Aries, but as it gets into Taurus, it digs in its heels and it's holding itself for the long haul. Mars moves into Taurus at 9:34 p.m. on Saturday, June 8th. And at the same time, we have the sun moving toward that square to Saturn. These, again, are tough days because we're going to see real resistance to change, and we're going to see an entrenching of the status quo, and yet we're also going to see the energy that is not going away, pushing up against that and demanding the change, especially since during this period of time on June 9th, the moon actually moves into Cancer, I said on Friday morning, but by the time we get to the 9th, midday on Sunday, the moon moves from Cancer into Leo. And it does it just after noon. So when we look at the noon chart here, we can see that the moon is still at 29 degrees of Cancer, but by 1 p.m., actually by 12:28 p.m., that specific time, of course, the moon moves into Leo. And now we got a situation, because when that moon moves into Leo, and even at that last degree, the moon is moving into that square to Mars, which has just moved into Taurus. And the moon, as it moves into Leo, fixed sign, is opposing Pluto at 1 degree, almost 2 degrees, but 1 degree of Aquarius fixed sign, and squaring Mars, which is squaring back to Pluto at just a half a degree of Taurus. And now we have some real conflict out in the open. The one saving grace is that Mercury, the communicator, moving through mid degrees of Gemini, is making a sextile and trine to the nodal axis, hopefully relieving some of that pressure from that relationship issue. And we can imagine what those relationships are, whether they are the dilemma of American politics or the dilemma of Mideastern politics, or so many other issues that are cooking around the planet. But that's all leading up to the 9th. By the time that we get to Monday the 10th, we can see that the moon is now moving through mid degrees of Leo, and Mercury is now moved from that half square to Chiron to the half square with Mars. Again, our words are not healing now. We want them to be, even though Mars is coming into that exact square to Pluto. I mean, it's close already, but it's not exact until Tuesday the 11th. But we have Mercury now at the square and a half point to Pluto, also exact later today, or actually early on the 11th. This is all tough stuff. These are words that don't necessarily have the healing intention that we want, and especially as Mars pushes towards the square to Pluto, and as we move to the 11th, the moon actually moves into Virgo, but not until later this evening at 10:38 p.m. So here we see at midday the moon still at 24 degrees of Leo. But on the 11th, we have Venus making a sextile with Chiron. There's a bit of softening energy here. Venus is making a sextile with Chiron, and in fact, the sun is coming into a sextile with Chiron. The moon is moving through a trine to Chiron, and therefore a sextile to the sun and Venus. We do get a little bit of reprieve here, but the moon is also making a square to Uranus, and so we have to be careful about pushing our energy too much, too hard, too fast, by putting on some sort of display. That would be the moon in Leo of a here I am, here's what's the truth, here's what's going on, and this can be a bit problematic. Also on the 11th, Mercury, as I mentioned before, comes into the exact square and a half to Pluto, as Mars comes into the exact square to Pluto. I just can't see us getting through this period of time without another round of disruption on one level or another. Even language here can be problematic. It runs into walls as as Mercury makes a square to Saturn. Remember that Venus made that square to Saturn back on October 8th. The Sun made the square to Saturn on not October 8th, on June 8th. Venus, let me say that again. Venus made a square to Saturn on June 8th. The Sun made its square to Saturn on June 9th, and now Mercury makes a square to Saturn on June 12th. These are all about authority and about rigid thinking and about not being able to adapt, even though the Gemini planets are all adaptable. There's something here preventing us, and it's the rule that kind of in some way gets in the way, or someone enforcing a rule or authority, whether it's valid or not. As we move on, as we move through the 12th, we're getting the effects of a few kind of easier aspects. As I mentioned earlier, the Sun moves into a sextile with Chiron. Mercury moves into a sextile with Chiron. Now Mercury, and that's on the 12th, and even on the 13th, we can see those sextiles building. The Sun is now sandwiched between Mercury and Venus. There's a lot of Gemini energy going on here. But again, as the Moon is moving through Virgo, it opposes Saturn, and there's a bit of squaring energy as the Moon opposes Saturn. This is on June 13th, and the Moon then will square the Mercury, Sun, and Venus all in Gemini, while the Sun by the 14th actually is conjoined by Mercury in its interior conjunction as it comes across the face of the Sun, or over that same zodiac degree, and that's at 9:32 a.m. Again, communication, intention, willpower here is strong, especially as the Moon on Friday morning moves into Libra at 11:12 a.m., and it then forms a trine with Pluto, and then over the hours ahead, it will then form a trine with Jupiter, kind of making a temporary self-sufficient air grand trine, self-referential, closed-circuit thinking with the Moon opposing Neptune. This is a very dynamic aspect. And we also see here that Mars, which remember made its exact square to Pluto on the 11th, by the 14th, Mars is making its exact half square to Saturn, Saturn having made its exact half square to Pluto last month, but it's still being within orb. And again, it's like the conflicts are not dying down. Even though we're moving into new territory, it's almost like the words are getting louder, the bifurcation is getting greater. Mars forming that semisquare with Saturn on the 14th is definitely running into a wall, and although there may be ways to move through it, I'm not sure that we have the facility or the wisdom to actually move through it. Maybe we can, and we do on an individual basis. I think it's important here always to think cosmically, but in acting locally, we can remember that we don't need to get caught up in every external circumstance that we perceive. There are times when inaction inaction isn't quite right, but let's say reserved action, because it isn't always best to act in the present moment, but it's always best to act in the right moment. So we do have some of that energy now with the intention of Mercury lining up with the Sun and the Moon making that trine to Pluto, but we also have some problematic energy with that Mars and Taurus being frustrated because things aren't moving fast enough, especially as it hits this kind of fogged out wall of Saturn moving through the watery sign of Pisces. Okay, that brings us to mid-month, and then moving onward. And I would note here that the second half of the month will cover a little bit lighter, because I will do the mid-month update, and of course that is available to everyone who is at the solar level in Patreon. That's just $3 a month, but I will give a day-by-day blow of the second half of the month at the mid-month update that will come out sometime around June 15th or 16th, right there in that week. But here on the 14th, we can see that the Moon has moved into Libra by midday. Again, it moved into Libra at 11:12 a.m., And as we continue to move on, by midday on the 15th, we can see that the moon is in mid-Libra, but we can also see that there are a couple of semi-sextiles which can be significant if you have planets at those degrees. The sun is semi-sextile to Uranus, the sun at 25, just barely 25 degrees at noon, and Uranus at just barely 25 degrees. It doesn't reach that until later tomorrow, I think. But that actually occurs on Saturday morning. If you have a planet at late 24 or 24, 25 degrees of pretty much any sign, that semi-sextile will have impact on you, typically in both an easy and complicated way. That's why the semi-sextiles, because there are points, let's say you have a planet at 24 or 25 degrees of Libra, well, then, or let's say at 24 or 25 degrees of even Leo, because at 25 degrees of Leo, it's going to be squared by Uranus and sextiled by the sun. And so there's always a square sextile or trine square, or an easy and a hard aspect when we have a semi-sextile. The same can be true of Mars's semi-sextile with Jupiter. Mars at 4 degrees of Taurus, next door to Jupiter at 4 degrees of Gemini. So if you have a planet at 4 degrees, it's going to be aspected either complicatedly and or easily by Mars and Jupiter simultaneously. By the time we get to the 16th, we have the moon moving into Scorpio, but not until later in the day. Actually, the moon moves into Scorpio at 11:37 p.m., just before the end of Sunday. But on the 16th, we also have Venus making a square with Neptune. Now, this Venus square Neptune, remember, this is Venus getting ready to change signs into Cancer, and over the next few days we're going to have a settling in of energy. Things are going to go a bit quieter, things may become a bit more dormant, but that doesn't mean they go away, because what we have going on is Venus will move into Cancer late on the 16th, then Mercury will move into Cancer on the 17th, and then the Sun will move into Cancer on the first day of summer in the Northern Hemisphere, at the winter solstice in the Southern Hemisphere, and that'll happen at 1:50 p.m. here in Seattle. And as each of these planets, Venus, then Mercury, then the Sun, one by one go into Cancer, the energy will root deeper, but before they change signs, they're each going to make a square with Neptune, which can confuse the energy. It can make things a little bit more complicated by it's harder to know what's going on, to know what's going on. And yet, on the other hand, we have this ability to be more visionary, to be more spiritual, to be more poetic. Great time to write poetry, but to not believe everything you say and not believe anything or everything that you hear. So, this is on the 16th. Venus moves into Cancer later in the day, just like I said, 11:20 p.m., but it squares Neptune earlier in the evening, just before 9 o'clock. And so we're getting this sense of falling in love with illusion, with magic. It's romantic, but we don't necessarily see the whole picture here. By the 17th, we can see that the moon has moved now into Scorpio, and this moon remains in Scorpio until Wednesday morning, the 19th. And as the moon moves through Scorpio, it's going to oppose Mars midday on Monday, the 17th. But also now Mercury is getting ready to change signs here midday. And as it does, it will square Neptune very early in the day at 12:40 a.m., and then it will move into Cancer at 2:06 a.m. So we can see here by midday, Mercury has already moved into Cancer. In fact, it has already surpassed Venus. And so we've had over the past few days the Venus moving across the sun, then Mercury moving across the sun, and Mercury moving across Venus also. And this is all happening at a point where the energy of communication and adaptability and communication is becoming more grounded. Grounded isn't the right word. More rooted, more in the wet earth, in the water. This is the Cancerian time of year when there's a lot of growth, but it occurs underground, out of sight. There's the roots that are kind of developing. It's the nurturing power of water and of the moon. When the planets are moving through Cancer, Mercury, Venus, and the sun in just a couple of days, the moon will become more important during this period of time because the sun is in the moon's sign, or at least it will be in a couple of days. By the time we get to the 19th, we can see that now we have planets that are moving through quincunxes to Pluto. So in other words, as before when they were moving into Gemini, they were making trines to Pluto. Now as Mercury, then Venus, and then the Sun move from Gemini into Cancer, they're each going to make a quincunx with Pluto. And of course, they're going to do that just after making the square to Neptune. So we get confused, we get spiritualized, we get spaced out, and then the reality factor sets in and we realize how we're not necessarily playing the same game as those people who are in power. There's a sense of having to adapt to the community. Mercury makes the quincunx with Venus. Mercury makes the quincunx with Pluto on the 17th in the evening. Then Venus makes the quincunx with Pluto on the 18th in the morning. And then the Sun will make the quincunx with Pluto on the 22nd, and we'll get there in just a moment. That'll be after the solstice and after the full moon, noticing here that the moon moving through Scorpio is moving toward its opposition as it moves through Sagittarius, and then by the time it gets to Capricorn, the sun will be on into Cancer. And let's move this ahead another day. There's the 19th, and now we can see here on the 19th that the moon has moved into Sagittarius. It does that at 9:31 a.m. on Wednesday the 19th. And then by the time we get to the 20th, we can see that the sun is squaring Neptune, the sun at 29 degrees of Gemini squaring squaring Neptune at 29 degrees of Pisces. This is less about culmination and fulfillment than it is about instability. There's a sense here of just not knowing what reality we can bank on. It's like there's too many... What's that saying? There's too many things up in the air. It's like having 1,000 coins being tossed, and we don't know where they're going to land yet. Even though there is movement, it's not settled. And that's the important thing. Also on the 20th, by 1:50 p.m., the sun moves from Gemini into Cancer. This is the summer solstice in the north. The daylight is longer now, and the days will begin to get shorter over the weeks and months ahead. And as we move to the 21st, we can see that Mercury is now at 9 degrees of Cancer, making a sextile with Mars, and each of the planets, Mercury, Venus, and the Sun, will move through that same sextile to Mars, hopefully giving us an opportunity to work with our determined energy of where we want to get to, rather than just acting impulsively in the moment with that Mars moving through determined Taurus. On the 21st, we also have the full moon at 6:07 p.m. The moon actually moves into Capricorn at 4:08 p.m. And then by 6:07 p.m., it is exactly full, and that occurs at 1 degree and 7 minutes of Capricorn. And this is really about a dilemma of how I feel. There's that's the sun in Cancer, the Mercury, the thinking about my homeland, my self-protection, what boundaries I need to feel safe, and Venus, how I love feeling safe when I'm in a place that is being nurtured, and yet the moon in Capricorn doesn't let me feel that way without having to realize that there is an external world. There's a relationship from the inner to the outer, from the personal to the career to the outgoing to the social place in the outer world. And this really is the height of our business now, especially because this full moon is squaring Neptune. And so we are sure that we do not have all the answers. Or let me say that differently. We're sure that we have all the answers, but everyone else or many other people may be sure that our answer isn't the right one, which may bring us into questioning what is reality. I think that becomes an important part of this full moon, and that's doubled down by the fact that we also have Mercury making a half square to Uranus, and Mercury making that half square to Uranus can be that we say things suddenly and maybe not without thinking them through. And again, that Mercury in Cancer may act out of a need for protecting itself. But the energy is complicated, especially because, as I mentioned earlier, by the 22nd, the sun comes into that exact quincunx to Pluto. And again, it's like we're up against a power structure that's more complicated than we gave it credit for. By the way, during the same period of time, we also have Mercury coming into the bendings or the skip step point, the halfway point between the nodes here at 11 degrees of Aries, Libra, and Mercury coming into that square point to the nodal axis on the 22nd, Venus coming into that same square point on the 26th, and then the sun coming into that same square point, but not until the beginning of July. But this is a bit of instability, and it's a bit of an opportunity to make something happen. This is the time when communication becomes really important, and I think that that's tied up with this full moon. I think it's very significant what we say, and as we move on from the 22nd, we really have a couple of days when there's not a lot of exact outer planet energy. The moon moving through Capricorn, though, is going to pick up on trines to Mars on Saturday the 22nd, and then on a trine to Uranus on the 23rd, and then on the 23rd the moon's going to move into Aquarius in the evening on Sunday the 23rd, and by the 24th that moon will be in Aquarius, and the moon moving into Aquarius on Sunday night will then join up with Pluto, and then it will make its quincunxes with the Cancerian planets, its trine to Jupiter. This is an active moon, but it's pushing us into the future. This is on the 24th. By the time we get to the 25th, we now have Venus stepping into that half square point where Mercury was back on the 21st. And again, Venus, what we want, there's this sense of impulsive energy that we may extend ourselves too much, but there's this sense of wanting to reach out of the box, wanting to break through, and desiring something that we don't have. The question is, will we find the courage to be able to do it? By the and also on the 25th, At 11:07 p.m., the moon moves into Pisces. And of course, as the moon moves through Pisces, it will catch up with both Saturn and with Neptune. And the moon will make trines with the sun, Venus, and Mercury over the next day or two. And so this will really intensify that watery energy of the Cancer sun and the Mercury Venus in Cancer. On the 26th, we also have Mercury in Cancer making a harmonious, smooth flowing trine to Saturn. It's almost like we get a reality check. We finally hear something we can trust. There's this sense of the stability, I think, coming through. The danger is becoming too rigid in our thinking. As that Mercury continues to move on, Mercury will then make a half square to Jupiter. This is important because Mercury is also making a square to Chiron. Jupiter is kind of right in the middle of that. So Jupiter is making a half square to Chiron. That's not exact until the 30th. But again, we have potential for healing here, but we also have the potential for saying things that are not well thought out, and we can say things that make things worse rather than better. But it's really important that we really think about what our long-term goals are here and how we can be Mercury and Cancer sensitive to what other people's wounds and hurts are. That's the Chiron and Aries with the half square to Jupiter and Gemini, and how we can take that and incorporate that into our vision. Also, we should note that Saturn is just about stationed now. Saturn is at 19 degrees and 26 minutes. 19 degrees and 26 minutes of Pisces. And in fact, it stays pretty much within a minute of arc from Thursday the 27th, pretty much all the way through July 3rd, because because Saturn turns retrograde on the 29th. And that retrograde on the 29th is very significant because it's setting into motion a deepening of where we are that will be doubled down when Neptune turns retrograde next month. Also, we have on the 28th Venus making a sextile to Mars. I talked about that earlier because Mercury made that sextile. Mercury made the sextile to Mars back on June 21st. And then Venus does, and the Sun will make it in July. But these are days in which our energy can work well if we honor our emotions and honor our feelings, but don't go to a place of fear. It's easy to go to fear with all these planets in Cancer. Instead, we need to remind ourselves that we can protect ourselves just like a crab does behind its hard outer shell. We have family and friends and ideas and values that we can use to give ourselves some solidity, even in the time of change. So Mars moves into the half square to Neptune on the 29th. Again, we're talking about more confusion, uncertainty, while Saturn is making its station here on Saturday the 29th. And Mercury is making a sextile with Uranus. Now, we're getting to say things that perhaps we've been held in, and we get to say things that are important, express them out in the open. And we end the month with Saturn being stationary retrograde. On the 30th, Jupiter makes that half square to Chiron that I mentioned earlier, because it really is a Mercury-Chiron square with Jupiter kind of half square, Mercury on one side and Chiron on the other. It's not an easy month at all, but no one can complain anymore that things aren't moving. Things are moving, maybe moving too fast, maybe moving in directions that we can't figure out. And again, I think it's really healthy to understand that it's early to It's too early to know exactly where the winds will blow us if we just simply put our sails up and let the winds blow us. We have to keep a goal. We have to keep a vision in sight. When those winds shift, we need to be adaptable. This is part of the Gemini lesson. And even as the planets move into Cancer, we need to be aware of what we need to do to protect ourselves from being blown into the rocks by the shifting winds. And so it's important that we pay attention to what's happening on a global level and on a level around us with our home, with our friends, with our family, so that we can maintain the safety and the security that we need in order to make sure that our long-term visions and our long-term goals are manifest not only over the months ahead, but even over the years ahead. That's it. It's quite a month. I'll see many of you for the detailed mid-month update. And other than that, all I can say is, as I always do, think cosmically, act locally. I'm Rick Levine. Be safe out there, and I'll see you all around.